Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're boarding a ship you already know the name of. You've seen the movie. You've seen the documentaries. You know how it ends. But tonight we're not walking the polished decks with the first-class passengers, admiring the chandeliers, listening to the string quartet warm up in the reception room. Tonight we're heading down. Down past the grand staircase, down past the gymnasium and the Turkish baths, down into the belly of the ship where the engines hum through the walls, and roughly 700 people are crammed into the cheapest tickets money could buy. Before we go down there, get comfortable. Settle into your pillow, dim the lights if you haven't already, and if this is your first night with the channel, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Let me know in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. If you'd rather listen on the go, the show is on Spotify now too, links in the description. And if tonight isn't enough to see you through until sunrise, there's a full-length 8-hour version waiting for you, ad-free for members. All right, lights down, let's go below deck. Before we step aboard, I want you to sit with a question for a moment. Have you ever really thought about what it would take to sell nearly everything you own for a boat ticket? Not a vacation ticket, not a maybe someday ticket. A one-way ticket into the complete unknown, on the promise of a better life that you cannot see, cannot touch, and cannot be entirely sure exists at all. Picture it. You are standing on a dock in April of 1912. You have one suitcase, maybe a bundle wrapped in cloth and tied with rope if a suitcase was too much of a luxury. You have said your goodbyes already, and some of those goodbyes were final in a way you tried not to think about too hard. Ahead of you is the largest moving object human beings have ever built. Behind you is everything you have ever known. And in your pocket is a ticket that cost you more than you have ever spent on anything in your life. Welcome aboard, you have 4 nights. Why you're here? Let's talk about why you would do something this reckless. Because make no mistake, buying a steerage ticket across the North Atlantic in 1912 was reckless. Nobody sensible does this. And yet here you are, along with roughly 700 other people who made the exact same calculation and landed on the exact same conclusion. Your ticket cost somewhere between 3 and 8 British pounds, depending on where you boarded and which class of steerage bunk you managed to secure. That number doesn't sound dramatic until you convert it into the only currency that actually mattered to you: labor. For most of the people boarding this ship tonight, that ticket represented somewhere close to 2 months of hard-earned wages. 2 months of whatever work you did back home, whether that was farming a plot of land that would never belong to you, working a loom in a textile mill, or laboring on someone else's fields for someone else's profit. 2 months of wages is not pocket change. It is not a splurge. In the world you're leaving, 2 months of wages is the difference between a house that stays warm through winter and one that doesn't. It's the gap between a family that eats through the lean months and one that has to explain to hungry children why the pot is empty again. And you have taken that entire cushion, every bit of security you had left, and converted it into a single, narrow bunk on a ship sailing toward a country you have never seen. If that sounds like madness, it's because it partly is. It's the same kind of madness as walking away from a stable, unglamorous job to bet everything on an idea nobody else believes in yet. History tends to call people who do this visionary after the fact, once things work out. In the moment, most of your neighbors probably just called you foolish or brave, depending on how kindly they wanted to phrase it. But you are not alone in this particular kind of madness. Look around this ship, and you'll find hundreds of people who ran the same numbers and reached the same answer, that staying was somehow the riskier bet. There's the Irish tenant farmer who will never own the land his family has worked for 3 generations. There's the family from a small village in Sweden whose cousin wrote home 2 years ago describing wages that sounded almost fictional. There's the trader from Lebanon who heard, through a chain of letters and rumors that stretched across an entire ocean, that America rewards ambition instead of punishing it. Different languages, different reasons, same math, same gamble. And here's the part that would make any modern financial planner faint clean away. You have almost nothing left. The ticket wiped you out. Whatever small amount of money you're carrying in a hidden pocket or sewn into a hem has to survive not just this crossing, but the inspection waiting on the other side, and the first uncertain weeks in a country where your entire support network might amount to one letter from a distant relative and a hastily scrawled address. You are, in the truest sense, betting your entire future on a single roll of dice you cannot even see. You don't speak the language of the person who will ultimately decide whether you're allowed to stay. You don't know the rules of the game you're playing. All you know is that the alternative, the life you're leaving behind, offered you nothing better than what you already had, and possibly less. But tonight, lying in your bunk for the first time, you're not dwelling on any of that. You're doing what every one of your fellow passengers is doing in this exact moment, imagining the life on the other side. A steady wage, a home with more than a single room, children who might grow up to become something you never had the chance to be. You folded that entire dream into a suitcase and carried it up the gangway, and no amount of engine noise is going to shake it loose tonight. Passing inspection. Of course, before any of that dreaming could begin, you had to prove your body was worthy of boarding at all. Let's rewind a few hours, back to the dock at Southampton. While the first and second class passengers strolled up their own gangway with barely a second glance from anyone, you stood in a line, a long one, and at the front of that line was a man in uniform whose entire job was to look you over and decide whether you were clean enough, healthy enough, and sturdy enough to be allowed among the paying public. He looked at your scalp for signs of lice. He looked at your hands. And then, if you were unlucky enough to draw his full attention, he took a small metal hook, sometimes nothing more official than a button hook borrowed from a boot repair kit, and used it to flip your upper eyelid inside out so he could inspect the underside. He was checking for a condition called trachoma, a contagious eye infection that was common enough in the crowded conditions many immigrants left behind, and serious enough that a diagnosis meant instant, automatic rejection at the American end of the journey. Imagine the least gentle eye exam you've ever had. Now remove any pretense of bedside manner. Now add a line of 300 anxious strangers behind you, each one watching to see how you react, because your reaction is about to become theirs. This inspection wasn't really about protecting your health, and everyone involved understood that, even if nobody said it aloud. It was about liability. The rules on the American side stated plainly that if a shipping company delivered a passenger who was then rejected by immigration officials as diseased or unfit, that company was responsible for shipping the rejected passenger all the way back across the Atlantic, at its own expense, plus a financial penalty on top. So the man with the hook wasn't inspecting you out of concern for your well-being. He was inspecting you the way a shipping warehouse inspects a crate it doesn't want returned with a complaint attached. Which means, in the coldest possible terms, your body has just become a kind of document, proof of fitness that no amount of money or good intentions could forge. It didn't matter how honestly you'd earned your ticket or how badly you wanted this new life. If your eyes were the wrong shade of red, if your scalp showed the wrong kind of flacking, if you coughed at precisely the wrong second, the entire journey could end before it began, right there on dry land, in front of everyone. So for days before boarding, you performed wellness like your life depended on it, because in a very real sense it did. You slept when you could. You washed as thoroughly as circumstances allowed. You practiced standing up straight and looking, above all else, robust, like someone who would absolutely not cost this shipping company a single additional penny. And here's the detail that should sit with you for a moment. None of this happened to the wealthy passengers boarding this same ship today. Nobody flipped a first-class eyelid inside out with a hook. Nobody checked a wealthy scalp for lice. Money, it turned out, functioned as its own certificate of health, an assumption baked so deeply into the system that nobody even had to say it out loud. The rich were guests. You were a risk that needed to be screened, priced, and accounted for. But you passed. Your eyes were clear. Your papers were in order. The man with the hook waved you through, and just like that, you were officially aboard the largest ship ever built. Now all you had to do was find out exactly what third class actually meant. That's where we'll pause for tonight's first stretch. In the next part, we'll head down into your actual sleeping quarters, the small metal cabin you'll share with strangers, the 2 bathtubs the entire third class has to fight over, and the dinner that turns out to be the biggest surprise of the whole voyage. Welcome back. Lights still down, fans still humming, let's pick up right where we left off. You've passed inspection. You're aboard. Now it's time to find out where exactly you're going to spend the next 4 nights of your life. Finding your bunk. Here's a piece of good news, and it genuinely is good news. You have an actual cabin. Not an open dormitory where hundreds of strangers sleep shoulder to shoulder on a bare deck, which is how steerage worked on plenty of other ships crossing the Atlantic in this era. The White Star Line built its third-class accommodations a notch above most of its competitors, and that matters more than you might think. Now here's the less flattering truth. Cabin is a generous word for what amounts to a small metal box, painted white, that you'll be sharing with up to 3 complete strangers. The bunks are narrow, somewhere around 4 feet wide, and bolted firmly to the floor so they don't slide across the room if the Atlantic decides to get temperamental. Your cabin sits low in the ship, tucked in close to the engines, which means your nightly soundtrack for the next 4 evenings is a deep, constant mechanical throb. Some passengers find it strangely soothing, almost like a heartbeat. Others lie awake staring at the ceiling, convinced they're slowly losing their minds one vibration at a time. You have electric lighting. You have a radiator. You have a solid roof over your head that doesn't leak. By the standards of the life you left behind, this is close to luxury, and you know it, even as you notice everything it isn't. Look at the walls for a second because they tell you exactly what this space was designed for. Plain painted metal. Nothing decorative. No wood paneling, no carpet, no little writing desk tucked into a corner. There are hooks on the wall instead of a wardrobe, because a wardrobe assumes you own more than one good outfit worth hanging up. Every design choice down here was made for one reason. It needed to be something that could be scrubbed clean quickly between voyages. Comfort wasn't really part of the equation. Your roommates are entirely a matter of luck. If you're traveling alone, you've been placed with strangers of the same sex, and you are now, whether you like it or not, about to learn the private nighttime habits of people you may never fully understand. One of them snores loud enough to rattle the metal walls. One of them mutters in his sleep in a language you don't recognize. And if the dice roll kindly, one of them turns out to be genuinely wonderful company, the closest thing you'll have to a friend for the rest of this crossing. It's a bit like being handed college roommates as a full-grown adult, except there's no request form for a transfer, and the building you're living in happens to be floating in the middle of an ocean. The bunks themselves come with a thin mattress and a blanket. If you've landed in one of the family or women's cabins toward the back of the ship, you might even get proper linens. The single men housed up in the bow get a slightly more basic setup, a straw-stuffed mattress, a blanket, and the general sense that comfort is reserved for other people tonight. Either way, nobody's providing you with sheets or pillowcases, which is fine because you packed your own, along with everything else you own in the world. And then there's the noise. Your cabin sits close enough to the engines that the entire space seems to hum with a low mechanical pulse, day and night, without pause. It vibrates through the metal walls into your bunk frame, and eventually it feels like into your own skull. Some passengers swear it rocks them straight to sleep, the largest, ugliest lullaby ever built. Others lie there for 4 straight nights, wide awake, composing furious letters to the ocean in their heads that they will never actually write. Still, you are warm. You are dry. You are fed, and you have a roof that isn't going anywhere. It really does feel like nearly luxury, right up until the moment you decide you'd like a bath and discover the single most alarming piece of arithmetic on this entire ship. The bathtub problem. Here's where the math gets genuinely grim. There are exactly 2 bathtubs allocated to the entire third-class section of this ship. 2. One for men, one for women, serving well over 700 passengers. Do that division and you start to understand why bathing down here wasn't a daily habit so much as a rare, carefully negotiated event, requiring a word with your steward, a scheduled time slot, and a fair amount of patience. Up on the higher decks, the wealthiest passengers had private porcelain tubs they could fill with hot or cold water, fresh or salt, essentially on a whim. Down here, you wait in a line that stretches back through half a dozen nationalities, and most people, when they actually run the numbers in their head, simply give up and wash at the sink instead. Sit with that ratio for a second, because it deserves your full attention. Roughly 700 people, 2 tubs. That works out to something in the neighborhood of 350 passengers per bathtub. If every single third-class passenger wanted just one proper bath across the entire crossing, and each bath took a reasonable half-hour including cleanup between uses, the tubs would need to run continuously around the clock for the whole voyage, and you still wouldn't get everyone through. The math simply doesn't close. Someone was always going to go unwashed, and on any given day, there's a fair chance that someone was you. Compare that to 2 floors up, where the arithmetic runs in the exact opposite direction. The finest suites had private bathrooms built right in, porcelain tubs a passenger could fill at the ring of a bell, hot or cold, fresh water or seawater, whichever struck their fancy. Even the ship's captain had his own private tub. Meanwhile, you're standing in a hallway doing long division in your head, trying to work out whether you'll manage to get clean before you reach a new continent. Getting your turn wasn't as simple as showing up with a towel, either. You had to arrange it, usually through your steward, who would slot you somewhere into the queue among your few hundred fellow hopefuls. When your moment finally arrived, you had a limited window to make the most of it before the next person started hovering outside the door, wondering if you'd drowned. So most passengers make the sensible call and simply opt out entirely. You wash at the small basin in your cabin instead, splashing your face, scrubbing whatever parts of you matter most, and making peace with the idea that you'll arrive in America clean in spirit, if not entirely in body. This isn't laziness, it's triage. When a proper bath is a rare and complicated privilege, the basin becomes your loyal daily companion, and you quietly accept that everyone around you is running the exact same slightly grubby calculation. Nobody's judging you, because everybody's in the same situation, which for once isn't just a figure of speech. The basin and the steward. Since the tub is essentially a fantasy, most of your actual washing happens at a small basin mounted in or near your cabin. This isn't the elegant plumbing enjoyed upstairs, where a steward could summon hot water almost like a magic trick. Down here, water is stored in a tank fixed to the wall, filled by hand whenever a steward gets around to it, and drained into a second tank below once you're finished. It's functional, it's fair in its own way, and it is deeply, thoroughly unglamorous. There's no tap that produces an endless stream of hot water on command. Instead, there's a tank on the wall holding exactly however much water your steward last poured into it, and when that runs dry, it stays dry until he returns. This turns something as basic as washing your face into a small exercise in resource management. You learn quickly to be economical. You learn that the very last splash of water in the morning is precious and shouldn't be wasted on anything frivolous, like actually enjoying it. Your steward, as a result, becomes a surprisingly important figure in your daily life. He's the one who fills the tank, and he's responsible for hundreds of tanks across hundreds of passengers, with only so many hours in his shift. Water arrives on his schedule, not yours. A conscientious steward keeps you reliably supplied and earns a grateful nod every time you pass him in the corridor. A slower one leaves you standing over a bone-dry basin at the exact moment you most want it to feel human again. When the water's gone, it doesn't disappear down some modern drain. It empties into a second holding tank beneath the basin, which the steward later drains by opening a valve. It's a closed, careful, slightly laborious little system, engineered for a ship that has to account for every liter of fresh water it carries across what is, essentially, a saltwater desert. None of it is luxurious, all of it works, and down here, working is really the entire point. You could stand there feeling sorry for yourself, comparing your modest wall tank to the marble washstands 2 decks up. Or you could do what most passengers actually do, which is remember what the alternative used to look like. Not so many years earlier, crossing this same ocean in the cheapest available class often meant open dormitories, zero privacy, no food provided by the ship at all, and washing conditions ranging from grim to non-existent. Against that backdrop, your private basin and steward-filled tank start to feel less like deprivation and more like an unexpected small mercy. That's the strange trick of third class on this particular ship. By modern standards, it's cramped, bare, and more than a little undignified. But measured against the life you actually lived before boarding, it's a genuinely startling step up. Clean water on the wall, electric light overhead, a roof that doesn't leak, a radiator, and food, real food that you didn't have to bring aboard yourself. You splash your face, feel almost respectable again, and head off toward the one part of the day that's about to exceed every single expectation you walked aboard with. Dinner is not a punishment. Here's a genuine plot twist. On most transatlantic ships of this era, steerage passengers had to bring and prepare their own food for the entire crossing, which usually meant clutching a small, sad bundle of bread and hard cheese and rationing it out across days at sea. Not here. On this ship, you're served 3 real meals a day in an actual dining saloon at proper long tables. The food is simple, but there's plenty of it. Tonight's dinner, this final Sunday of the voyage, includes rice soup, fresh bread, roast beef with gravy, sweet corn, boiled potatoes, and plum pudding with sweet sauce to finish. For a good number of the people sitting at these tables tonight, this single meal contains more meat than they saw in an entire month back home. You eat until you're genuinely full, and for a little while, the walls between classes seem to melt away into gravy. To really appreciate how good this is, you have to understand what most of these passengers were braced for before boarding. The stories from earlier decades of transatlantic crossings were bleak. On many ships, a steerage ticket bought you nothing but a bunk, and you were expected to pack and manage your own food for the entire voyage, eating it cold, alone in a corner. People carried dried bread, hard cured meats, whatever would survive the trip without spoiling, and hoped for the best. Being fed properly, 3 times a day in an actual dining room, is the kind of upgrade that leaves grown adults a little emotional over a simple bowl of soup. And it isn't just that there's food, it's that there's enough of it. You can eat until you're actually completely full, which for a great many of these passengers is a genuinely unfamiliar sensation. Back home, full was reserved for feast days and weddings. Here, it happens on a random Sunday evening because the kitchen simply keeps producing bread and beef and potatoes as though the supply were bottomless. Half of you keep waiting for someone to announce that the deal is off. Nobody does. You go back for seconds. The dining saloon itself becomes a small daily miracle of unplanned social engineering. You file in and sit shoulder to shoulder at long shared tables with a rotating cast of strangers, and something remarkable happens over the course of these meals. An Irish father passes the bread basket to a Lebanese family 2 seats down. A Scandinavian mother helps quiet a stranger's fussing toddler. Nobody at the table can fully understand anybody else's language. And yet the basic grammar of a shared meal, pass this, thank you, is this seat taken, translates perfectly well in any accent going. For the length of dinner, the categories that govern the rest of the ship quietly dissolve into the simple, universal business of eating together. This particular Sunday menu is worth lingering on, because it will turn out to be the very last proper meal many of these passengers ever eat. Rice soup to start. Fresh baked bread, roast beef swimming in gravy, sweet corn and boiled potatoes piled beside it. And then, almost unbelievably for a third-class ticket, dessert, plum pudding with sweet sauce and fruit. It's a hearty, honest, generous spread, the kind of meal a working family might dream about for months, served without any ceremony to hundreds of people who never expected anything like it from the cheapest ticket on the ship. They ate well that night. It's one of the few small comforts in this entire story that is simply, plainly true. So you push back from the table, pleasantly full, warmer and happier than you have any real right to be tonight, and you drift along with the crowd toward the sound of music drifting down the corridor. Because a good meal down here turns out to be only the opening act. The general room. After dinner, you drift with the crowd toward the general room, which is the closest thing Steerage has to a pub, a living room and a village square, all pressed into one modest space. There's an upright piano in the corner, and there's always somebody willing to sit down and play it, whether or not they actually should. Before long, someone else produces a fiddle. Someone has smuggled aboard a set of bagpipes. Somebody else has a battered accordion, or a tin whistle, or just a pair of spoons and the confidence to use them. And soon there's dancing, clapping, and singing in half a dozen languages that nobody in the room fully understands, yet somehow everybody joins in anyway. This is where the loneliness of leaving everything behind gets drowned out, at least for an evening, by the noise of 100 other people who left everything behind too. You don't know most of these people. You'll likely never see them again after this voyage ends. But tonight, you're all pointed at the exact same horizon, and that shared direction is enough to turn a room full of strangers into something that feels, for a few hours, like a very loud, very temporary family. The room itself is nothing fancy. Plain wooden benches, hard-wearing surfaces built to survive a few hundred restless passengers every single night of the crossing. But nobody's here for the furniture. This is the one space on the entire ship where third class is simply allowed to be loud, alive, and completely unbothered, and everybody takes full advantage of it. The music is the engine that drives the whole evening. There's always that upright piano and always someone at the keys, whether they've had lessons or not. Around that anchor, a small, chaotic, entirely unrehearsed orchestra assembles itself out of whatever instruments people happen to carry aboard. A fiddle here, bagpipes from a Scotsman who was never going to leave them behind, whatever the crossing demanded, an accordion, a tin whistle. A set of spoons in the hands of someone who has very clearly done this before. None of it is planned. All of it works, more or less, and the less it works, the harder everyone laughs and the louder they keep going anyway. Then comes the dancing, and this is where the language barrier reveals itself to be no barrier at all. You can't hold a conversation with the Finnish family across the room or the Italian teenagers by the wall, but you can absolutely dance near them, clap along to their song, and stamp your feet when the rhythm demands it. A jig doesn't require a translator. A reel needs no dictionary. People teach each other steps through pure gesture and grinning, and for a few hours, this cramped little room becomes one of the least lonely places on the entire North Atlantic, a spontaneous festival thrown by people who have never met before and will very likely never meet again. But underneath all that joy runs something softer and a little sadder, because every song is also a kind of goodbye. These are the tunes of home, the melodies your mother used to hum while working, the ballads sung at weddings in villages you will probably never walk through again. When someone strikes up a familiar air from your own corner of the world, it lands somewhere deep, and you find yourself singing along with a lump in your throat and a smile on your face at exactly the same moment. Everyone in the room is doing this, each person quietly mourning their own particular home while celebrating the enormous leap they've all taken together. That's the strange, quiet magic of the general room. It holds the grief and the hope at the very same time, the ache of what you left pressed right up against the thrill of what you're chasing, folded into one warm, noisy evening you'll remember for the rest of your life, however long or short that life turns out to be. Eventually the songs wind down, the musicians pack away their instruments, and you step out for a breath of cold night air, which brings us to the one patch of open deck that third class can genuinely call its own. Your patch of deck. Third class does get a slice of the outdoors, tucked toward the ends of the ship where the views aren't especially impressive. It's a modest stretch of open deck, nothing like the sweeping promenades where first-class passengers stroll in their furs. But it's yours. You lean against the rail, the wind slaps at your face, and the Atlantic rolls out gray and endless in every direction you can see. Children chase each other across the planks. Men lean together at the railing, smoking, talking about the jobs supposedly waiting for them on the other side. You can't see America yet, obviously. You stare west anyway, because staring west has basically become your full-time hobby at this point in the voyage. For a few minutes, the low ceiling and the humming walls disappear entirely. It's just you and an enormous sky. The location of your deck space tells its own quiet story. It's shoved toward the front and back of the ship, the practical working ends where the machinery lives, while the middle of the vessel, the smoothest riding, best viewed real estate, belongs entirely to the people who paid for it. You get the leftovers. The windswept corners nobody important particularly wanted. But after hours cooped up in a low metal cabin listening to engines hum through the walls, a windswept corner feels like paradise, and you're not about to complain about the address. The wind up here doesn't so much blow as attack. Out on the open Atlantic, there's nothing to slow it down, so it arrives cold, hard and salty, snatching hats and reddening faces and cutting straight through even your best coat. And you love it anyway. You gulp it down like something you've been starved of, because in a sense you have been. 4 nights of stale below-deck air makes even a brutal sea wind taste like freedom. The deck has developed its own little society by now. Children treat it as the largest, most dangerous playground imaginable, tearing across the planks while mothers who have long since given up on the concept of caution shout half-hearted warnings after them. Men gather at the rail to smoke and talk, and the talk is almost always about the exact same thing: the future, the job a cousin promised, the wages they've heard rumors about, the plan for the first month ashore. Everyone is rehearsing their American life out loud, testing the dream against the salt air, making it feel a little more real each time they say it to another person. And of course you look west. You can't help it. There's nothing out there but gray water folding into gray sky, no land, no coastline, no answer to the one question everyone's silently asking, which is simply, how much longer? But you stare anyway, because looking in that direction feels like doing something, even when there's genuinely nothing to do. The whole deck faces the same way tonight. A crowd of hopeful people squinting at an empty horizon, willing a continent into existence through sheer wanting. For those few minutes at the rail, with the wind cutting through your coat, all the small indignities of third class fall away completely. The bathtub math, the humming cabin walls, none of it matters up here under this enormous open sky. You're simply a person on a ship, chasing a life, breathing free, cold air. It's one of the purest pleasures this entire voyage has to offer. Then the cold wins, as it always eventually does, and you head back down toward your bunk, past a detail of the ship's layout so ordinary that you barely register it tonight. Single men bunked toward the front of the ship. Families and women tucked away toward the back. It seems harmless right now. It is about to matter enormously. Bow and stern. Here's a detail that feels completely unremarkable in this moment, and will become one of the most consequential facts of this entire story later on. The ship keeps unmarried men housed in the bow, the very front of the vessel, while families and single women are placed toward the stern, the back. It's a tidy arrangement, designed with one purpose in mind: keeping respectable young women at a safe, appropriate distance from several hundred unattached young men. By the standards of the time, it makes perfect, uncontroversial sense. So if you're traveling as a family tonight, your grown sons might be sleeping half the length of the ship away from you, separated by corridors, staircases, and locked partitions. Right now, this is simply an inconvenience, a longer walk to say goodnight than you'd prefer. It's the kind of small logistical decision nobody thinks twice about. Remember it, the layout of this ship is about to become a matter of who survives and who doesn't. The reasoning behind the arrangement is pure Edwardian propriety, and on its own terms, it's entirely sensible. With hundreds of single young men aboard, alongside hundreds of single young women and families with daughters, the respectable, expected thing to do is keep them separated after dark. So the unmarried men are sent forward up into the bow, into quarters with straw mattresses and basic blankets, while women, children, and families settle into the stern, in cabins that come with proper linens and wash basins. It's a moral floor plan, essentially. Chastity enforced through architecture. On a calm, ordinary crossing, this arrangement causes nothing worse than mild inconvenience. If you're a father traveling with your family and you have two grown sons berthed up in the bow, saying goodnight tonight involves an actual expedition. The full length of the ship, down long corridors, up and down staircases, through the partitions separating each section. It's a genuine hike. You make it anyway. You clap your sons on the shoulder, tell them to sleep well, and make the long walk back to your wife and younger children waiting in the stern. It's routine, a little tiresome, completely, reassuringly ordinary. But notice what this arrangement has quietly done without anyone intending it. It has taken entire families and scattered them across the full length of a genuinely enormous ship, with the most vulnerable members, the women and the youngest children, at one distant end, and the young men at the other. Under normal circumstances, that distance means absolutely nothing. Everyone's heading to the same destination, at the same speed. The gap between bow and stern is measured only in minutes of walking, a distance made entirely of convenience, and convenience is cheap when the sea is calm and the ship is whole. The trouble is that this particular ship sits low in the water, and its steerage quarters sit lowest of all, and the young men berthed in the bow are sleeping in the exact part of the vessel closest to the waterline at the front. Geography that means absolutely nothing tonight will mean everything in a few days' time, because when real trouble comes to a ship, it doesn't arrive politely, spreading evenly to every cabin at once. It comes to one specific place first, and it comes fast, and the people nearest to it get the least amount of warning and the least amount of time to react. The floor plan drawn up purely for the sake of Edwardian modesty is also, though nobody has thought of it in these terms, a map of exactly who is standing closest to danger. For now, though, it's just a long walk and a fond good night. You leave your sons up at the bow, you head back to your family's cabin in the stern, and you think nothing more of it. The gates. Scattered throughout this ship are barriers and partitions that keep third class physically separated from second and first. Officially, this has nothing to do with snobbery. It's the law. American immigration regulations require that steerage passengers be kept apart from everyone else aboard, so they can be inspected together as a single group upon arrival. On paper, then, these gates are simply a public health measure. In practice, they also happen to ensure that the people who paid the least never intrude on the sight lines of the people who paid the most. During a calm crossing, you barely register them. They're just part of the furniture of being poor aboard a very rich ship. Whether every single one of these gates was locked on the final night is a question people are still arguing about more than a century later. Here's the official reasoning, and it isn't entirely a fabrication. American authorities, worried about the spread of disease arriving alongside the massive waves of European immigrants, required that steerage passengers be kept physically separate from first and second class travelers for the duration of the voyage. The idea was to keep the group facing medical inspection contained, so that if illness broke out, it would stay isolated below decks rather than spreading through the entire vessel. sold as sensible hygiene, a legal requirement rather than an insult. On paper, it's almost reasonable. But peel back that paperwork and you find the other function, the one nobody printed in any official brochure. These same barriers conveniently ensured that the shabby, hopeful, many-accented world of third class never once intruded on the champagne and chandeliers happening 2 decks up. The wealthy never had to see you, smell you, or share so much as a staircase with you. Your entire section of the ship existed as its own sealed universe, close enough to serve the practical machinery of the voyage, far enough to remain completely invisible. Public health and social snobbery, as it turns out, could be enforced by the exact same locked gate. Remarkably efficient. During the calm days of this crossing, these barriers are almost beneath your notice. They're simply the edges of your world. You go where you're permitted to go. You eat where you're meant to eat. You take your air on your own designated scrap of deck. And the gates are just quiet boundary markers, as ignorable as the low ceilings and the humming walls, and you stop consciously seeing them the same way you stop seeing anything you pass by every single day. And that's precisely why they're so dangerous, though you have no way of knowing it yet. A barrier you've stopped noticing is a barrier you've never planned a route around. You've never had to find your way past one of these gates in a hurry, in the dark, with the crew scattered and the corridors filling with frightened people. You have no mental map of which gates open where, which ones might be guarded, which ones might be shut fast when it matters most. Why would you? Nobody hands steerage passengers a diagram of the escape routes, because, in the thinking of this era, steerage passengers were never really expected to need one. Whether every gate was deliberately locked that final night, or whether it was more a matter of confusion, missing crew, language barriers, and simple bad luck, is something historians have debated ever since, and the honest truth is almost certainly a tangled mixture of all of it. What isn't in dispute is the effect. When the worst finally arrived, the people penned deepest in the ship, behind the most barriers with the least guidance, ended up with the hardest possible path to safety of anyone aboard. For now, though, the gates just sit there, quiet and closed and completely unremarkable, and you walk past them without a second glance, heading into a ship so vast and so genuinely bewildering that simply locating your own bunk starts to feel like a small daily achievement. Getting lost. Try at some point over these 4 nights to actually navigate this ship with any confidence. It's enormous. 11 decks tall, a floating city stitched together with corridors, staircases, and dead ends, and third class sits near the very bottom of all of it. There are no helpful signs pointing you toward the boat deck, because you have no official business ever being on the boat deck. The routes you're permitted to use twist and double back on themselves, and the crew members who know this ship the way you know your own childhood street are mostly busy elsewhere, running an operation far larger than any single one of them can fully see. During a pleasant voyage, getting a little lost is a funny story you tell at dinner. You took a wrong turn, ended up somewhere you clearly weren't supposed to be, and a steward laughed and pointed you back home. It's charming. It's practically a game. It will stop being a game the night you need to find the top of this ship in the dark, quickly, with the floor tilting under your feet. Start with the sheer scale of the thing. This isn't a boat. It's a small vertical town, 11 stacked decks connected by staircases that don't always line up cleanly, corridors running for what feels like miles, a warren of passages designed by engineers who understood the mechanics of a ship far better than they understood a frightened stranger trying to find her way out from a bunk near the very bottom. The open air is many floors up and a considerable distance sideways, along a route that was never laid out with your convenience in mind. And here's the crucial part. Nobody made it easy for you on purpose. There are no clear signs guiding third class toward the lifeboats, because in the entire design philosophy of this ship, third class was never expected to need the lifeboats before everyone else already had. The idea that steerage passengers might one day have to sprint for the top deck simply wasn't part of the plan. So the signage that does exist points you toward the places you're allowed to be, and stays politely, completely silent about everything else, which happens to be most of the ship. The paths you're legally permitted to use form their own puzzle. They wind. They climb a bit, then descend again. They pass through those quiet gates and partitions, connecting your world to the upper decks by the least direct route imaginable, to someone who's spent years working aboard. All of this is perfectly logical, a familiar honeycomb they could navigate blindfolded. To you, 4 nights into the voyage, it's a bewildering tangle, and you've only learned the handful of routes you actually use each day. Bunk to dining saloon to general room to your patch of deck, and back again. When you do get lost, and you will, it's genuinely funny in the moment. You set off confidently for the dining saloon, take one wrong turn, and suddenly find yourself somewhere entirely unfamiliar. A corridor you've never seen before. A stairway leading to a door you don't quite dare open. Eventually, a passing steward finds you looking thoroughly lost, chuckles, and steers you back towards steerage where you belong. You laugh about it later. You tell your cabin mates. Everyone on this ship has a story just like it. The vessel is so enormous it swallows people whole and spits them back out a deck away from where they meant to be. In the calm of an ordinary crossing, this is nothing more than mild comedy. But file that laughter away carefully, because the joke has a much darker twin. The same maze that misplaces you harmlessly on a random Tuesday afternoon is the exact maze that will stand between you and survival when it actually matters. Knowing only your daily handful of routes is perfectly fine when your biggest worry is arriving late for soup. It becomes catastrophic when you need to reach the highest deck of an 11-story ship within a matter of minutes, in the dark, against a moving crowd, with the floor no longer level beneath you. A world of many tongues. For now, though, you find your way, shrug off your wrong turns, and rejoin the great multilingual crowd of your fellow travelers. A crowd so varied it's genuinely a wonder anyone understands anyone else at all. Look around the dining saloon on any given evening, and you'll hear the whole world talking at once. Third class is packed with people from everywhere. Irish and English passengers, Scandinavians, Lebanese and Syrian traders, Italians, Eastern Europeans, and more, each one carrying their own language, their own food traditions, and their own private reasons for chasing America. It's a magnificent, chaotic mix, and most of the time it works beautifully, because everyone falls back on the universal languages of pointing, laughing, and passing bread around the table. But it also means that vital information doesn't travel easily down here. An instruction shouted in English is completely useless to a mother who speaks only Arabic or only Finnish. Right now, tonight, that's simply the colorful texture of the crossing. Later, it becomes one more reason why news of real danger reaches some passengers slowly and reaches others not at all. Take a proper look at this crowd, because it really is extraordinary for its time. Irish families fleeing hard land and even harder prospects. Scandinavian families heading toward relatives already settled somewhere on the American plains. Lebanese and Syrian traders chasing new opportunity. Italians, Eastern Europeans, English passengers, and dozens of other nationalities, all pressed together into the same low decks, the same dining saloon, the same general room. It's one of the most genuinely diverse gatherings of humanity assembled anywhere in the world at that particular moment. And it's happening entirely by accident, in the cheapest quarters of a ship, among people who share nothing in common, except the fact that they could only afford a steerage ticket. Most of the time, this mix is a marvel rather than a problem, because human beings tend to be resourceful and warm when they actually want to be. You can't discuss politics with the Finnish family seated across from you, but you can smile, pass the bread, and mime enthusiastically that the roast beef is worth having seconds of. Card games spring up that require no shared vocabulary at all. Children, gloriously indifferent to the entire question of language, simply run around together shrieking in a tongue of pure play that every single one of them speaks fluently. Kindness, it turns out, translates, so does laughter, so does a shared dream. But there's a hidden cost buried inside all this beautiful confusion, and it lives in the gaps between languages. Information doesn't flow freely through a crowd that shares no common tongue. A joke can survive on gesture alone. A complicated warning cannot. If something urgent needed to reach every single soul in third class, quickly and clearly, there is no single language that would land with all of them at once. You'd need to say it many times in many different tongues to many different groups and hope it landed correctly each time. On a calm evening, this is merely a charming quirk of the crossing. Consider what it means in practice, though. There are mothers down here who understand only the language of the village they left behind last week. There are men who can follow a card game in any accent on earth, but couldn't pass along an urgent English instruction to save their lives, quite possibly literally. They rely entirely on their own small circle, family, countrymen, the handful of people who speak their words, to tell them what's actually happening around them. Their entire world of available information is small, bounded tightly by language, an island floating within the larger island of Steerage itself. So the Tower of Babel that makes your evening so rich, strange, and joyful is also, quietly, a vulnerability. When everything is calm, the language barrier costs you nothing worse than the occasional misunderstanding and a lot of enthusiastic pointing. But information is survival. And a crowd that can't easily be told something all at once is a crowd that will learn important news unevenly, in fragments, too late for some of its members. Hold that thought lightly for now, and let it settle beneath the surface, the way it settled beneath the surface of these real people's real lives. The long, slow middle. Let's be honest about something nobody puts in the postcards. An ocean crossing is not a non-stop party. Most of your waking hours aboard this ship are spent doing remarkably little, because there is, genuinely, very little to do. You walk the short stretch of deck allotted to you. You eat. You nap in your bunk to the steady lullaby of the engines. You get to know the faces around you a little better each day. And for a fair number of your fellow passengers, the sea decides to introduce itself directly, turning the grand adventure into a queasy, green-faced ordeal spent lying as still as humanly possible while quietly questioning every decision that led to this moment. The days blur together, marked out only by mealtimes and the slow shift of light through the handful of portholes near your cabin. It isn't exciting, it isn't especially comfortable, but it is safe, and it is steady, and every hour that passes is 1 hour closer to a brand new life. The truth about an ocean voyage, for all its romance in the retelling decades later, is that it's mostly a great deal of waiting. There's no scenery to speak of beyond water in every direction, the same water you saw yesterday and will see again tomorrow. There's no schedule beyond the rhythm of meals. There are no attractions down here, no gymnasium, no swimming pool, no elegant cafe to while away an afternoon. Those belong entirely to the passengers upstairs. Your entertainment is whatever you and your fellow travelers can manufacture out of conversation, card games, music, and the slow, patient art of doing absolutely nothing at all. So you fall into a rhythm, and the rhythm is small. A turn around your patch of deck to breathe some cold air, a meal at the long communal tables, a nap in your humming bunk, rocked by the ceaseless throb of engines that never quite let you forget you're aboard a machine, not simply floating on the sea. You learn the faces around you, the snorer, the singer, the surprisingly delightful cabin mate, and you build the small, temporary relationships that carry you through each day. Time is measured out not in hours but in events. Breakfast, deck, lunch, deck, dinner, music, sleep, and then the whole gentle loop begins again the next morning. And then there's the sea itself, which doesn't always cooperate. For a good number of passengers, the rolling of the ship isn't soothing at all. It's a slow torment. Seasickness turns the grand adventure into an ordeal of clammy skin and a heaving stomach, and you spend hour after hour lying as still as possible in your bunk, eyes shut, breathing carefully, bargaining silently with your own body, and wondering, in your lowest moments, whether spending 2 months of hard-earned wages to feel this wretched was truly your finest decision. It passes mostly. It always feels in the moment like it never will. The days smear together in a way that's almost dreamlike. Light shifts through the portholes from gray to bright to gray to dark again, and you begin to lose track of which day it actually is. And it doesn't much matter, because every day down here is essentially the same day, worn just a little thinner. Time on the open ocean has a strange, stretched quality, both endless and oddly forgettable all at once. You begin to feel as though you've always lived in this humming metal world and will go on living in it forever, suspended somewhere between the life you left behind and the life you can't quite reach yet. But underneath all that tedium runs a steady current of pure anticipation, and that's what actually carries you through. Yes, it's boring. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Yes, some of you are genuinely, miserably ill. But it's also safe and steady and always moving west. And every dull hour that ticks away is 1 hour closer to the moment the coastline finally rises up out of the water. You're almost there. You can feel it in your chest. Which makes it worth pausing to remember exactly what you carried aboard for this journey. Because everything you own for the rest of your life is currently stowed beneath your bunk. What you carried. Reach under your bunk and there it is. Your entire life, folded into a single suitcase or a bundle tied together with rope if a proper case was too much of a luxury to afford. Everything you decided was worth carrying across an ocean is sitting right there. Your good clothes, saved carefully for the day you step off the ship and want to look like someone worth hearing. A handful of letters. A photograph or two of the people you left behind. Perhaps a small religious token. A piece of jewelry. A family recipe written out in someone's familiar handwriting. Since the ship provides no sheets or pillowcases, you likely packed your own linens too, which now double as bedding. There's something quietly heartbreaking about it if you let yourself look too closely. A whole existence reduced to whatever 2 arms can lift. But you carry it lightly, because you aren't mourning what you packed. You're thinking constantly about everything you're going to build once you finally get to unpack it. Think for a moment about the decisions that went into that bundle, because packing for this trip was its own small agony. You could only take what you could physically carry, which meant every single object had to justify its place. Keep this. Leave that behind. The chair your father built with his own hands, too large, left behind. The good cooking pot, too heavy, handed off to a neighbor instead. Piece by piece, you whittled an entire household down to a single case, and every item that survived the cut earned its place by being either useful, valuable, or simply too precious to abandon. What you're carrying isn't just luggage, it's the short list of your entire life. The clothes form the practical heart of it. Somewhere in that case is your very best outfit, kept clean and completely unworn, saved for the moment you walk off the ship and stand in front of immigration officials, and soon after, in front of the strangers who might decide to give you work. You understand, instinctively, that first impressions in a new country will matter enormously, that looking respectable and capable could be the difference between landing a job and having a door closed in your face. So you guard those good clothes like treasure, resisting every temptation to wear them during the voyage, because they aren't for now. They're for the version of yourself who arrives. Then there are the things that serve no practical purpose whatsoever, and those are the ones that would break your heart if you let them. A photograph of your parents, or your children, or a sweetheart you may or may not ever see again. A letter read so many times the creases have gone soft as cloth. A small religious token, pressed into your hand at the docks by someone with tears in their eyes. A piece of jewelry worth almost nothing in money and everything in memory. These are your anchors to the world you left, proof that you came from somewhere and that someone somewhere loved you there. There may even be a recipe, written out in a familiar hand, the taste of home reduced to ink on a scrap of paper, so that one day, in a strange kitchen in a strange country, you can make the thing your mother used to make and be, for one brief moment, back in a place that no longer exists for you. It's such a small thing to carry. It's such an enormous thing to lose. There's a real sorrow in it if you look too hard. A life so easily lifted, so easily carried, so easily lost. But you don't look too hard because you didn't pack all this to grieve it. You packed it to plant it somewhere new. Every folded shirt is a future job. Every photograph a family you intend to build again. Every small token a blessing on the road ahead. You aren't carrying the past across this ocean. You're carrying the seeds of what comes next. One more gate. And what comes next, you've already been warned, begins with one final gauntlet. An island, a long line, and an inspection more thorough and more frightening than the one waiting for you back at the dock in Southampton. Understand clearly that this ship is not the finish line. In your imagination, America is the moment the coastline first appears on the horizon. In reality, there's one more barrier standing between you and the country itself, and it's a famous one. A great immigration station sitting on its own island in the harbor, where the poor and hopeful arrivals are funneled, sorted, examined, and judged before they're permitted to set foot on the mainland proper. The wealthy passengers upstairs will mostly be waved through with barely a glance. You will not be so fortunate. For you, arrival means the line, and the line is not gentle. Doctors wait at the top of it, trained to assess a human being in the handful of seconds it takes them to walk past. They'll watch how you climb a flight of stairs, looking for any limp or labored breath that might suggest a weak heart or damaged lungs. They'll scan your face, your skin, your eyes. That eye inspection again, the dreaded check for the same contagious infection that means automatic, non-negotiable rejection. With a small piece of chalk, they mark the coat of anyone who worries them, a letter scrawled across the shoulder that pulls you out of the hopeful stream and into a far more frightening one. That chalk mark is the thing you've been quietly dreading this entire voyage, whether or not you've ever put the fear into words. Because rejection at this final stage isn't a small setback. It's the total collapse of everything. You've sold your possessions. You've spent 2 months of wages. You've said your permanent goodbyes. You've crossed an entire ocean. And all of it can be undone in an instant by one stranger's judgment at the very last step. Fail the inspection and you aren't simply turned away, you're shipped back across the same cold water, toward a home that no longer has any place left for you. The dream doesn't just stall, it reverses entirely. This is why your behavior aboard this ship isn't nearly as idle as it might look from the outside. That careful rest in your humming bunk, that mindful eating, that quiet instinct to stay well, all of it is preparation, whether you consciously think of it that way or not. You're trying to arrive as the healthiest, strongest, most obviously capable version of yourself, because somewhere deep down, you know you're going to be judged the very moment you land. You can't control the doctors or the officials or the chalk in their hands. You can only control how well you arrive. So carry this thought with you as the voyage rolls on. The sea is only the middle of your journey, not the end of it. The real test still waits on the far shore. And in a sense, everything about this crossing is a quiet rehearsal for passing it. The fourth night. You're so close now, close enough to taste it. And the fourth night is upon you, a Sunday, calm and clear and quietly perfect. It will feel in the moment like the very best night of the entire voyage. In a way, it is. In every other way, it's the one you'll wish more than any other that you could have back. The calm is the first thing everyone notices. The Atlantic, which spent the earlier days of this crossing doing its level best to empty your stomach, has gone flat and still, a great dark sheet of glass stretching out to the horizon in every direction. The ship glides. The awful rolling has stopped entirely, and all across Steerage, the passengers who spent the crossing so far lying miserably in their bunks are finally upright, finally smiling, finally able to enjoy a meal without turning a shade of green. It feels like a gift. This sudden smoothness, a reward for having survived the worst days already behind you. There's good news traveling through the decks tonight too, passed mouth to mouth in half a dozen languages. The ship is fast, faster than anyone quite expected, cutting through the calm water at a fine pace, and there's talk tonight that you might reach New York early. The word lands like a small joy in every heart that hears it. Sooner to land, sooner to the island, sooner to the life waiting on the other side of that inspection. The mood across third class visibly lifts on that rumor, everyone quietly recalculating the hours between here and the new world, everyone just a little more hopeful than they were yesterday. Dinner that Sunday is the finest of the entire voyage, and you eat it without any idea that it will be the last one. The rice soup, the fresh bread, the roast beef under its blanket of gravy with sweet corn and boiled potatoes piled alongside, and then the plum pudding, sweet sauce, and fruit to finish. You eat until you're full, warm, and content at the long table, surrounded by faces you've come to genuinely know over these 4 days. It's a good meal, an honest and generous one. And it sends you off into the evening with a satisfied heart and a settled stomach. Afterward, the general room fills one final time, and tonight the music turns gentler. It's a Sunday, so there are hymns tonight, soft and slow and heavy with longing, voices rising in Irish and Swedish and Arabic and English, all reaching toward the same low white ceiling, each person singing toward their own private idea of home or heaven or both at once. Children grow drowsy and are carried off to their bunks. Couples linger in the warmth, reluctant to let the evening end. There's a tenderness in the room tonight, a sweetness, the unmistakable sound of hopeful people finally at rest. It's colder outside than it's been on any previous night of the crossing, noticeably colder, the kind of cold that bites the moment you step out for air. But nobody thinks much of it. Cold is just weather, and weather isn't your concern tonight, tucked safely inside this vast, celebrated, supposedly unsinkable ship. So you climb into your bunk, full and warm and content. 4 nights down. A 5th day ahead that might, if the rumors are true, bring an early arrival. And the engines hum beneath you, exactly as they have every single night since Southampton. Your eyes close, it is a good night. Hold on to it. The shudder. You feel it before you understand it. Not a crash, not a scream. Just a strange grinding shudder that runs through the ship and directly into your bunk, followed by a stillness that is, somehow, worse than the shudder itself. Down here, near the front of the ship, closer to the waterline than anyone berthed above you, some passengers feel it far more sharply than others. A few report ice sliding past their portholes in the dark. A handful in the most forward cabins notice water beginning to seep in along the floor, cold, quiet, and completely impossible. Most of you simply stir, listen for a moment, decide it was nothing, and settle back down because the engines have gone silent. And silence, after 4 straight nights of humming, feels odd, but not obviously dangerous. You don't know it yet, but the ship has already been given its wound, and the clock that matters most has just started counting down. It isn't a dramatic sound, and that's part of why it doesn't alarm you. There's no great bang, no violent lurch throwing you clean out of your bunk. There's a shudder, a long, grinding tremble that passes through the steel of the ship and into the frame of your bed, felt more than actually heard. It lasts a few seconds and then it's gone. If you're deeply asleep, you might not wake at all. If you're only dozing, you open your eyes, frown into the darkness, and wait to see whether anything else happens. What happens is silence, and the silence turns out to be the strangest part of all. For 4 nights, the engines have throbbed beneath everything, a constant heartbeat you stopped consciously hearing days ago. Now they've stopped completely. The absence is loud in its own particular way, a sudden quiet that presses against your ears and tells you something has changed, even if you can't quite say what. A ship that has hummed without pause since Southampton has gone still. And stillness, after so much steady motion, feels wrong in a way you can't quite name. Your position on the ship shapes exactly what you experience in these first few minutes. Steerage sits low, near the waterline, and the single men are berthed right up in the bow, the very front of the ship, the exact place where the hull met the ice. So some passengers down here felt that shudder more sharply than the sleeping first-class passengers far above. A few, pressed close to the hull, saw something pale slide past their small portholes in the dark, a wall of ice gliding by, there and then gone. Most did not, and wouldn't learn until much later what the ship had actually struck in the night. In the most forward cabins, a handful of passengers noticed something that should be flatly impossible. Water. Not much at first. Just a cold, dark seep creeping along the floor where no water has any business being, soaking quietly into shoes and bags in the corners of the room. It's slow and out of place, and the people who see it feel the first genuine prickle of unease, the sense that this is not a normal night, that whatever happened a few minutes ago has opened the ship to the sea itself. But they are few, and they are far below, and their alarm has no easy way to travel upward through the ship. For the vast majority of passengers, the reasonable thing to do is exactly what you do. You listen. You decide it wasn't worth leaving a warm bunk over. The ship is unsinkable. Everyone has said so, repeatedly, since the moment you boarded, and a shudder followed by silence is hardly cause to abandon a good night's sleep 4 nights into a difficult voyage. So you pull the blanket back up, close your eyes, and settle into the dark once more. It isn't foolishness, it's trust. Ordinary human trust in a ship that was promised over and over to be safe. But high above you, in rooms you will never see, men who fully understand what has just happened are already running the terrible arithmetic. And the answer they've reached is one that nobody is coming down to explain to you. The gap between knowing and not knowing. The minutes that follow are defined entirely by not knowing. Up on the boat deck, officers already understand that the ship is doomed. Down here, you understand almost nothing. There's no clear announcement reaching every corner of third class. No calm voice explaining what's happened or what you should do next. Some stewards move through the passageways, urging people to get up, to fetch their life belts. Others are visibly unsure themselves, and the message arrives unevenly, in fragments, in languages half the passengers down here can't follow at all. Some are told to simply wait. Some are told nothing whatsoever. So you sit in your cabin, life belt in hand or still stowed away untouched, waiting for someone with real authority to tell you that this is serious. The trouble is that the people who actually have the answers are several decks above you, and the water is already climbing steadily toward you from below. Think for a moment about the sheer size of that gap between what's known and what you know. Far above, in the quiet rooms where this ship is actually run, the truth has already been fully understood. The wound is mortal. The sea is pouring in faster than any pump aboard can push it back out. The men in charge know, with grim certainty, that this enormous ship has only a couple of hours left to float. That knowledge exists, complete and terrible, at the very top of the vessel. It simply hasn't made the long journey down to you yet, and there's no reliable system in place for it to do so. There's no way to speak calmly and clearly into every cabin at once. No single voice capable of reaching all 700 of you in the languages you actually understand. Word has to travel the old way, carried person to person, deck to deck, and it moves slowly and unevenly through a ship this size. By the time it filters all the way down to steerage, it arrives in scraps. Half a rumor here, a fragment there, contradicting itself. Impossible to fully trust. Some stewards genuinely try, and their effort is real. They move through the passageways of third class, knocking on doors, rousing sleepers, telling people to put on their life belts and start making their way up. These men are doing their best, and their best matters. But there aren't enough of them, they can't be everywhere at once, and many are nearly as uncertain as the passengers themselves about how urgent this truly is. So the warning reaches some corridors and completely misses others. One family is roused and hurried along. The family in the very next passage sleeps on, completely undisturbed, with no idea that anything is wrong at all. The language barrier, that colorful quirk that made your evenings in the general room so warm and strange, now turns quietly, genuinely deadly. A steward calling out urgent instructions in English is nothing but a wall of meaningless sound to a mother who speaks only her village's tongue. She can see the urgency written across his face, perhaps, but she can't understand the words. Can't tell whether he's saying come immediately or wait right here. Can't ask any of the questions that might save her children. The very diversity that made the general room sing on Sunday night is now scattering the warning into pieces that not everyone down here can gather back together in time. And so you find yourself trapped in a terrible kind of limbo, sitting in your cabin, maybe with your life belt clutched in your hands, maybe with it still stowed away untouched, waiting for someone official, someone certain. Someone with real authority to tell you plainly that this is real and that you must go now. Some of you have been told to wait, and so you wait, obedient and trusting, exactly as a lifetime of being the people who wait has trained you to be. Some of you have been told nothing at all. The awful truth is that the answer you're waiting for is not coming down to you in time. And every single minute you spend trusting that it will, the water is rising through the decks below, and the distance you'll soon need to climb is growing steadily longer. The climb. Eventually, the truth becomes impossible to ignore, and now you must do the one thing this ship was never designed to let you do easily. You must get from the bottom to the top. The maze that was a charming inconvenience on a calm afternoon has become, in the space of a few terrifying minutes, a life-or-death puzzle in the freezing dark. The familiar routes feel confusing. The unfamiliar ones feel worse. And the corridors are filling steadily with frightened people who don't know the way any better than you do. Families try desperately to stay together, clutching children in suitcases, moving upward through a ship that tilts a little more with every passing minute. Some of you find a crew member who genuinely knows a path and follow him with something close to gratitude. Others wander, doubling back, searching for a staircase that leads somewhere, anywhere, useful. Every wrong turn costs time. And tonight, time is the one thing nobody down here can afford to spare. The moment of real realization arrives differently for each person, but it arrives. The tilt of the floor grows harder and harder to dismiss as nothing. The rising alarm in the voices around you becomes contagious. Someone sees the water with their own eyes. Someone starts to run. And all at once, the trusting stillness of the last half hour breaks completely, and you understand in your bones that no one is coming to save you where you sit. That if you're going to live, you have to move now upward, toward air and open sky and whatever waits on the highest deck. But moving turns out to be the hardest part, because this ship was never built to send you upward quickly. The honeycomb of corridors and staircases you learned only in fragments now stands directly between you and survival, and in the dark, with the floor canting steadily beneath your feet, even the routes you thought you knew turned treacherous. Was it this passage or the next one over? Does this particular staircase lead up or only deeper down? The comfortable landmarks of 4 calm days dissolve into a bewildering tangle, and you find yourself navigating not just a maze, but a maze that is slowly, steadily tilting further out of true with every passing minute. You're not doing this alone, and that turns out to be both a comfort and an obstacle at once. The passages fill with your fellow travelers, hundreds of frightened people surging in the same general direction, clutching children, dragging the very suitcases that hold everything they own because they simply cannot bear to leave their whole lives behind. Even now, even here, families link hands and try desperately to stay together in the crush. Voices call out names in a dozen different languages. Everyone is climbing, and everyone, in some sense, is lost. The crowd that made the general room feel so warm just hours ago has become a crowd that slows every step and blocks every narrow staircase. If you're lucky, you find a crew member who genuinely knows the way, and you follow him with a kind of desperate gratitude as he leads a small knot of passengers up through passages you would never have found on your own. These moments happen, real acts of guidance carved out of the chaos, and they save lives without question. But there are far too few guides for far too many people, spread across far too much ship. and most of you are left to find your own way, relying on instinct and rumor, and the general direction the crowd seems to be flowing, hopping desperately that the press of bodies is moving toward safety and not toward a dead end. So you climb, and you double back, and you climb again, and every wrong turn in that tilting darkness isn't just frustration anymore. It's time, and time has become the one currency none of you can afford to spend carelessly tonight. The ship isn't waiting patiently for you to find the correct route. The sea is rising through the decks behind you at its own relentless, indifferent pace, and the gap between where you started and where you desperately need to be was always, from the very beginning, the longest gap of anyone aboard this ship tonight. The gates again. And even for those of you who successfully navigate the maze, who push up through the crowds and the confusion toward the light above, there's one more obstacle waiting. The quiet barriers you stopped noticing days ago. The gates. Now suddenly, those gates matter more than almost anything else in the world. Some are opened by crew members who wave third-class passengers straight through toward the upper decks without hesitation. Others stay shut, or remain guarded, or simply can't be located at all in the chaos, leaving entire groups of people penned behind a barrier while the sea continues rising behind them. Exactly how many gates were locked, and for how long, and whether it reflected genuine cruelty or simple confusion or the crush of habit and overwhelmed crew, is something historians have argued over for more than 100 years now. And the honest answer is that it was almost certainly not one single, simple thing. But the effect is not in dispute. For a great many third-class passengers, the path to the lifeboats was longer, more obstructed, and more genuinely uncertain than it was for anyone berthed above them. You paid the least for your ticket. You were placed the deepest in the ship. And now, when every single second counted, you had the furthest possible distance left to climb. Remember the barriers you walked past for 4 straight days without a second glance. The partitions that kept steerage in its designated place, sold to you as a simple matter of law and hygiene, faded so completely into the background of daily life that you genuinely stopped seeing them at all. Tonight, they come roaring back into significance, because they stand directly across the path between you and the open decks where the lifeboats wait. The invisible boundary of your ordinary daily life has become, without warning, the visible edge of your chances of survival. In some places, the barriers open freely. A crew member reaches a gate, unlocks or unbolts it, and waves the crowd of third-class passengers through toward the stairs leading up and out. Where this happens, people pour through and press on toward the boat deck, given a genuine fighting chance by one person standing in the right place at the right moment. These openings are real, and the people who found them are counted among those who survived. Not every path was sealed, not every door stayed shut. But in other places, the story is considerably grimmer. Some gates stay closed. Some are guarded by crew who, following orders or old habit or their own confusion, hold people back, telling them to wait, to be patient, that their turn will come eventually. Some barriers simply can't be found or opened in the dark by frightened passengers who never learned the route in the first place. And so groups of people, entire families among them, end up penned behind a locked or blocked partition, waiting for a release that arrives too late or never arrives at all, while the water climbs the deck steadily below them. Historians have argued for over a century now about exactly what happened at those gates that night. How many were locked? For how long? Whether it reflected deliberate cruelty, a callous decision to keep steerage below until their betters had reached safety, or something messier and more human. Orders misunderstood, crew overwhelmed beyond capacity, a language barrier turning a clear instruction into pure confusion, the sheer chaos of a sinking ship that no one aboard had truly been prepared for. The honest answer is that it was almost certainly not one single villainous choice, but a tangle of law, habit, confusion, and neglect, all pulling steadily in the same terrible direction. And here's the thing about that tangle. It didn't need a villain to be deadly. The effect isn't in dispute, whatever the intention behind it actually was. For the people in third class, the road to the lifeboats was longer, more blocked, more bewildering, and more uncertain than it was for anyone berthed above them. You paid the least for your ticket. You were placed the deepest in the ship. And now, on the one night it mattered more than any other night of your life, you had the furthest distance to climb and the most obstacles standing in your way. Arriving too late. For those of you who somehow made it through the maze and past the gates, there was one more thing waiting on the open deck, and it was, without question, the cruelest sight of the entire night. You arrived to find the boats already pulling away. Suppose you make it. Suppose you climb and search, and stumble your way up through the cold and the crowds and finally burst out onto the open boat deck at last. What you find there breaks something inside you. The lifeboats are already swinging away from the ship, many of them already lowered into the black water far below, and some of them, unbelievably, are not even full. The people who reached this deck first, the ones who slept nearest to it, the ones who were never separated from it by gates and staircases and language, have largely already gone. You're standing there in the bitter night air, having survived the entire maze, and you've arrived to a party that is already ending. The ship tilts steadily under your feet. The stars overhead are astonishingly bright, and there are far fewer seats remaining than there are people still climbing up to look for them. The cold hits you first, after the close warmth of the lower decks. The open air is shockingly, brutally cold, the kind that reaches straight through your clothes and into your chest with the very first breath. You've climbed for what felt like an eternity through the tilting maze and past the barriers, and now, at last, you're out under the open sky. For one brief moment, the sheer size of the night is genuinely overwhelming. And then you look toward the boats and your stomach drops, because you understand at once that you are late. The lifeboats are leaving. Some are already gone entirely, dark shapes low on the black water far below, pulling steadily away from the ship. Others are in the act of being lowered right now, swinging out over the side on their ropes, descending toward the sea with their passengers already aboard. You scan them desperately, searching for any empty seat. And what you see is almost impossible to accept. Many of these boats aren't full. There are visible gaps on the benches, spaces that could easily have held another person, a mother, a child, lowered away half empty into the darkness while people still crowd the deck above, desperately searching for exactly the kind of space now disappearing beneath them. It's a truth that would haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. In the confusion and disbelief of those early minutes, before the danger felt fully real to the people already up on the boat deck, boats were sent down carrying far fewer passengers than they could actually hold. People had been reluctant to leave what felt like the safety of an enormous ship for a small boat dangling precariously over a black ocean. Officers, uncertain and overwhelmed themselves, let the boats go rather than force the issue. And so precious seats descended toward the water empty, while far below and behind them, you were still fighting your way up through the ship. Look closely at who is already gone, and the pattern is impossible to miss. The people who filled those early boats were overwhelmingly the passengers who had the shortest distance to travel, those berthed high in the ship, near the boat deck, who felt the danger sooner and reached the boats first. Those who were never slowed by a maze of unfamiliar corridors, never held back at a barrier, never left uncertain because the warning arrived in a language they couldn't read. Proximity was survival. And proximity, it turns out, was something money had already decided days before this ship ever met the ice. So you stand there in the freezing dark, having done everything right, having climbed and searched and refused to give up at any point, and you've arrived to find the best chances already lowered away without you. The deck tilts a little more beneath your feet. Above you, the sky is scattered with more stars than you've ever seen in your life, impossibly clear, impossibly beautiful, and completely indifferent. And around you press the others who also made it up too late, A growing crowd of hopeful people scanning a deck that has far too few seats left to offer any of them. Never enough boats. To understand why there were so few seats left, you have to know a truth that was built into this ship long before you ever boarded it. There were never going to be enough lifeboats. Not for first class, not for second, not for anyone. This ship carried lifeboats for only about half the souls aboard because the maritime regulations of the era decided that was sufficient, and because too many boats were thought to clutter up the elegant lines of the upper decks. So even in a perfectly orderly evacuation, with everything going exactly right, hundreds of people were always going to be left behind. And when there simply aren't enough seats to begin with, the people at the bottom of the ship and the bottom of the social order are the ones most likely to end up standing on deck with nowhere left to go. The shortage wasn't an oversight in any ordinary sense of the word. It was a decision, made well in advance, in full accordance with the maritime regulations of the time. Sit with the arithmetic of it for a moment, because it's worse than any single individual failure that occurred on the night itself. There were somewhere in the region of 2,200 people aboard this ship, and the lifeboats, all of them, could hold only around half that number. Run the numbers, and the conclusion becomes unavoidable. Even if every single boat had launched perfectly full, in calm and orderly fashion, without a single seat wasted anywhere, more than 1,000 people were always going to be left aboard a sinking ship with nowhere else to go. The disaster wasn't only in how the boats were loaded on the night. It was baked into how few of them existed to load in the first place. The regulations governing how many lifeboats a ship of this size was legally required to carry were badly out of date, written years earlier for smaller vessels, and they judged this enormous ship perfectly compliant while carrying far too few boats for the number of souls aboard. On paper, everything was entirely in order. This ship carried exactly as many lifeboats as the law demanded, and the law demanded a number that would doom well over 1,000 people the moment it was genuinely put to the test. There was another reason too, quieter and considerably more damning, and it had everything to do with appearances. More lifeboats lining the decks would have cluttered the clean, elegant sweep of the promenades where wealthy passengers like to stroll in their furs. A vessel marketed and promoted as practically unsinkable didn't, in the minds of the men who built it, need to bristle with lifeboats like some nervous, second-rate steamer. So the deck stayed handsome. The boats stayed few. And the gap between the number of people aboard and the number of available seats simply wasn't something anyone seriously expected to matter. Now layer the realities of class on top of that fixed, fatal shortage, and your own position becomes painfully clear. When there aren't enough seats for everyone, the question that actually matters becomes, who gets the ones that do exist? And that question was already being answered quietly, by distance, by information, by every single advantage of proximity that wealth had already handed to the passengers berthed above you. The shortage guaranteed that a great many people would die tonight. The structure of the ship guaranteed that those deaths would be drawn disproportionately from the decks below. You didn't lose your seat on this ship tonight. In a very real sense, it was never printed for you at all. This is the fact beneath all the other facts, the one that makes the maze and the gates and the late warning so much crueler in hindsight. Even if every one of those failures had somehow gone perfectly, even in the fairest, most orderly version imaginable of this exact night, the boat still would have run out. There was never room for everyone. And the people with the least room to begin with were people just like you, deepest in the ship, furthest from the too few boats, and last to arrive at a deck where the seats had already disappeared. Women and children first. And what happened next on that crowded, tilting deck turned on a rule the world would go on to remember as noble. It's worth looking closely, though, at exactly who that rule actually reached. You've heard the phrase your entire life, women and children first. It's the noble rule this whole disaster is remembered for, and it was real and it genuinely did save lives. But look closely at who it actually saved. Nearly every woman and child in first class lived. Every single child in second class lived. And in third class, more than half of the women died and most of the children never made it off the ship at all. The rule was applied. It just wasn't applied evenly, and it wasn't applied in the end to everyone equally. The rule itself was genuine, and it deserves to be remembered honestly as such. On that night, as the boats were loaded, women and children were given priority, and a great many men stood back deliberately to let them pass, knowing full well, standing there on that tilting deck, that they were choosing to remain aboard a ship that was going to sink. That was real courage, real sacrifice, and it absolutely did save a great many lives that would otherwise have been lost that night. This isn't a story about a rule that turned out to be a lie. It's a story about a rule that was entirely true and still, somehow, not enough. Look at the numbers broken down by class, though, and a much harder truth begins to emerge. In first class, almost every woman and child aboard survived the night. In second class, every single child lived. These are the figures of a rule working precisely as intended: the vulnerable protected, the innocent carried safely away. If those numbers had held true for the entire ship, this night would be remembered today as a genuine triumph of decency in the face of catastrophe. But go down into third class, and that same rule produces a devastatingly different result. More than half of the women in steerage died that night. Most of the children in third class never left the ship at all. The rule that saved nearly every woman and child above somehow failed the women and children below, and it failed them so completely that the contrast between the two outcomes can only honestly be called an indictment. The same principle, applied to the same disaster, on the exact same night, produced survival above and death below, sorted almost perfectly by the price stamped on a ticket. The explanation isn't that the rule deliberately excluded third-class women and children on paper. It's that the rule could only ever save the people who actually managed to reach the boats, and the women and children of third class were, overwhelmingly, the ones least able to get there. They were furthest from the boat deck, buried deepest in the ship. They were the least likely to have understood the early warnings, cut off as they were by both language and the slow, uneven way news actually traveled down through the decks. They arrived last, if they arrived at all, at a deck where the available seats had already gone. The rule waited patiently at the top of a climb that far too many of these women and children never had a real chance to make. Those who would not leave. And there's one more quieter reason woven through the third-class survival figures, and it may be the most human reason of all. Many third-class women simply would not leave. Faced with a boat that might carry them to safety, they refused to step aboard without their husbands, without their grown sons berthed far away up in the bow, without the family they had crossed an entire ocean beside. To survive alone, to be saved while the people they loved most were left behind and lost, was a bargain some of them simply, flatly refused to make. So they stayed, and the rule that might have saved them stood there unused, because it asked them to leave behind the very reason they had made this crossing in the first place. And that separation, families scattered across the full length of a sinking ship, wasn't chance. The ship itself had arranged it days earlier for the sake of propriety. Remember the tidy sleeping arrangement: single men in the bow, families and women in the stern. Tonight, that decision reaches its terrible, final conclusion. Families that boarded together are now scattered across the length of a sinking ship, mothers at one end trying desperately to reach sons stranded at the other. The flooding water pouring in first and fastest at the very front, exactly where the young men slept. Some families managed to gather and climb together in time. Many did not, and spent their final minutes searching corridors for faces they would never find. There are documented accounts of parents pushing a child toward a lifeboat and then stepping back themselves, of husbands lifting their wives over the rail and letting go, of entire families who simply chose to stay together, deciding that whatever came next was better faced as one than survived apart. The ship had split these families up for the sake of appearances, bow and stern, men separated from women. The ocean never gave them the time to come back together again. The water. For those who did not reach a boat, the end came not from the ship itself, but from the sea. And this is a part of the story that deserves to be spoken about gently. The North Atlantic that night sat just below freezing. A person immersed in water that cold does not have long, not minutes to spare. And the lifebelts that kept bodies afloat could do nothing to keep them warm. The boats that had pulled away, many of them only half full, mostly did not return until it was far too late to matter. Some held back out of genuine fear of being swamped by desperate swimmers. Some simply froze, unable to decide, unable to act, drifting in the dark while the sound carried across the water toward them. So the greatest loss of that whole enormous night was, in the end, a quiet one. Not the drama of the ship finally slipping beneath the surface, but the slow, cold stilling of hundreds of people afterward, out in the dark, within sight of the very lifeboats that might have saved them. The water itself was cold beyond almost anything most people alive at the time had ever experienced. Cold enough that the sea became, in the final accounting, the thing that claimed the greatest number of lives that night, not the ship, not the wreckage, not the fall, but simply the temperature of the ocean people were left in. A person entering that water did not have long. The cold worked quickly, and there was nothing anyone caught in it could do to slow it down. The life belts, so carefully handed out and fastened in those last frantic minutes, turned out to be both a blessing and, in a way, a cruelty. They did their job. They kept people afloat, faces above the surface, so that no one simply slipped under and disappeared. But floating was never the same thing as surviving. The belts could hold a body up. They could not warm it. And so, rather than saving people from the freezing water, they held people present and visible within it, reachable in theory, if only anyone had come back for them in time. And this is the part survivors could never quite forgive, themselves or anyone else. The boats had pulled away, many carrying far fewer people than they could have held, and for the most part, they did not turn back. Some held off out of a genuine, understandable fear that rowing into a mass of people struggling in the water would result in the boat being swamped, and everyone aboard lost along with them. Some simply froze in place, unable to decide, drifting in the darkness while cries carried across the flat, black water. By the time a handful of boats finally did turn back to look, there was almost no one left alive to save. So the greatest loss of that entire night ended up being, in the truest sense, a quiet one. Not the spectacle of the ship going down, but the slow, gradual stilling of hundreds of people in the black water afterward, beneath a sky that was, by all accounts, impossibly clear and beautiful and completely indifferent to what was happening beneath it. It wasn't violent. It wasn't sudden. It was cold and patient and terribly gradual, and it claimed the largest share of the dead not in one single moment, but over the long, slow minutes that followed the ship's final disappearance beneath the surface. We don't need to dwell further on the details of it, and doing so wouldn't honor the people who experienced it. What matters is who they were. The majority of those lost that night were not the famous names that filled the newspapers for years afterward, not the wealthy passengers whose final gestures were recounted and re-recounted for generations. They were the people from the bottom of the ship, the immigrant families, the hopeful poor. The men, women, and children of third class, going quiet together in the dark water, so far from the shore they had crossed an entire ocean to reach. Those who survived. Not everyone was lost, though, and their stories deserve to be told with just as much care as the ones who didn't make it through the night. Of the roughly 700 people traveling in third class, only around 170 lived to see morning. But they lived. They were pulled from the lifeboats onto the deck of a rescue ship, wrapped in blankets, given hot drinks, and counted at last among the saved. Many had lost everyone they had been traveling with. Some were children now completely alone in the world, unable to say their own names in English to the strangers trying desperately to help them. They arrived in America not as the hopeful immigrants who had originally boarded, but as survivors of something the entire world was about to give a name to, carrying grief where their luggage should have been. Their new lives began anyway, quieter and heavier than anyone had planned, and that they went on to build those lives at all is its own kind of stubborn, ordinary heroism. It's worth holding on to the fact that not everyone was lost because it genuinely matters. Of the roughly 700 souls in third class, around 170 came through the night alive. It's a small fraction, a bitter number set against how many should have lived, but it is not nothing. It represents dozens of people who climbed the maze successfully, or found an open gate, or reached a boat in time, or were pulled from the freezing water before it was too late, and who saw the sun come up over a world that had very nearly taken everything from them. Their salvation had a name, and it belonged to another ship, one that heard the distress calls in the middle of the night and drove hard through ice-strewn waters, at real risk to itself, to reach the scene as fast as it possibly could. As dawn broke over a sea scattered with lifeboats, the survivors were brought alongside and lifted aboard, wrapped in blankets, given the simple animal comforts of warmth and safety after hours of terror and bitter cold. For the people in those boats who had spent the entire night with no idea whether rescue would ever actually come, the sight of that approaching ship was the difference between despair and life itself. But survival, for the people of third class, rarely came whole. So many of them had boarded as complete families, crossed the ocean together as families, and now sat on the deck of the rescue ship having lost the very people they had come with. A wife without her husband, a mother without her children, a child without either parent. The night had carried away the people they loved most and left them behind alive, but hollowed out, saved into a grief that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Some of the survivors were children, and their situation was the most heartbreaking of all. Little ones pulled from the disaster now found themselves entirely alone in the world, their parents gone beneath the water, unable even to explain who they were to the well-meaning strangers trying to help them, because they spoke no English and could not make their own names understood. They had set out for a new country under the care of a family. They arrived under the care of no one at all, small and lost and utterly bereft in a place where they couldn't so much as ask for their own mother. And yet their lives went on, because lives do. These survivors reached America after all. Not as the eager, hopeful immigrants who had climbed the gangway back at Southampton, but as something else entirely, people marked forever by a single night, carrying memory and loss where their luggage should have been. They found the relatives who had been waiting on the pier for an entire family and delivered instead only a fragment of one. They started over, quieter and heavier than they had ever planned, in the very country they had crossed an ocean to reach. That they built any kind of life at all out of that beginning is its own quiet, stubborn form of heroism, and it deserves to be remembered right alongside the sorrow. Even in death, the way the dead were treated in the days that followed showed, painfully, that the divisions of the ship did not end when the ship itself did. In the days after the sinking, ships were sent out to recover bodies from the water, and even in death, the divisions held firm. When the recovery crews worked through the wreckage, bodies identified as first-class passengers were placed in proper coffins and laid out respectfully on deck. The bodies of second- and third-class passengers, along with the crew who had served them all, were sewn into weighted canvas bags and packed in ice down in the hold. A great many bodies were simply committed back to the ocean where they were found, because there wasn't room aboard to carry everyone home. The same logic that had placed you deepest in the ship and furthest from the boats followed you past the very end of your life. It decided the container you were carried in, and whether you would be brought back to shore at all. Class, it turns out, did not stop at the waterline. It went all the way down and then, unbelievably, a little further still. It was a somber task, this recovery work, moving slowly through the debris field and the freezing water, gathering up the dead. It should have been the one place where the divisions of the living finally, mercifully fell away, where the dead were simply the dead, equal at last in the most basic sense. It was not. For the bodies identified as first-class passengers, there were proper wooden coffins, brought aboard and laid out with real dignity, so these dead could be carried home and buried by their families with whatever ceremony their station in life had always afforded them. Even here, at the very end, wealth was still granted the trappings of respect, remains handled as belonging to important people whose passing would be marked and mourned in newspapers and family plots alike. For the bodies of second- and third-class passengers and for the crew, there were no coffins. There were canvas bags into which the dead were carefully sewn, weighted, and then packed in ice down in the hold of the recovery ship. The distinction was stark and it was deliberate, a sorting of the dead along the exact same lines that had sorted the living. Coffins on the open deck for some, canvas in the hold for the rest. The class you had traveled in decided, quite literally, the manner in which your body was kept. Worse still, a great many of the dead were never brought to shore at all. There were simply too many bodies and too little room, and hard, practical decisions were made about who could be carried home and who could not. Many of the recovered dead, overwhelmingly from the lower classes and the crew, were committed back to the sea where they'd been found, given a brief service and returned to the water, because there was neither the physical space, nor in the cold calculus of the era the perceived worth, to bring every single one of them home. So the same logic that had shaped this entire story followed these passengers past its very end. It had placed them deepest in the ship, furthest from the boats, last to be warned and last to be saved. And now, with nothing left to save, it reached even into death itself, deciding whether a body was laid in a coffin or sewn into canvas, whether it was carried home to a grave a family could one day visit, or return to the water to vanish for good. The inquiry. When it was finally over, the questions began. Formal inquiries were convened on both sides of the Atlantic, tasked with explaining how so many people had died. People asked, quite reasonably, whether the third-class passengers had been deliberately held back, whether their path to the boats had been blocked on purpose, whether they had been treated unfairly in those final hours. And the official inquiry considered the question and concluded in effect that no, there had been no deliberate mistreatment. That third-class passengers had not been unfairly kept from the boats. It was a tidy answer. It let a great many people off the hook, and it sat uneasily against the plain arithmetic of who had lived and who had died, an arithmetic so lopsided by class that it hardly needed a conspiracy to explain it at all. Once the initial shock had begun to settle across two continents, the world demanded real answers, and formal inquiries were convened to provide them, one on each side of the Atlantic, tasked with sifting carefully through testimony and wreckage to understand exactly what had happened. This was meant to be the moment for genuine accountability. The chance to look honestly at how a ship full of hopeful people had been allowed to sink with so few of them saved, and to ask the hard questions about who had been protected that night, and who had simply been left behind. And the hard questions were asked, at least on the surface. People wanted to know, quite reasonably, whether third-class passengers had been deliberately held back, whether the gates and barriers had kept them penned below while their social betters escaped ahead of them, whether they had been refused their fair place in the boats, treated as somehow lesser even in the face of death itself. These were the right questions to ask, the exact questions the lopsided survival figures practically demanded. And for a moment, it seemed the inquiry might genuinely reckon with them. But the answer the official inquiry ultimately arrived at was, in effect, that nothing improper had actually occurred. It concluded that there had been no deliberate mistreatment of third-class passengers, that they had not been unfairly kept from the boats, and that the terrible disparity in who lived and who died was not the result of any specific intention to sacrifice the poor in favor of the rich. The system, in the judgment of the system itself, had done nothing wrong. The matter was officially closed. It was a very tidy answer, and its tidiness is exactly what should trouble you. It absolved the shipping line. It absolved the officers and crew. It absolved the rules and regulations, and the entire comfortable structure that had built a ship with too few lifeboats and had buried its poorest passengers deepest inside it. With a handful of careful conclusions, a great many people who might reasonably have been held responsible were quietly let off the hook, and the disaster was reshaped, in the official record, into a tragedy of bad luck and cold water, rather than a failure of how everything had been arranged from the very start. And yet the answer had to sit alongside the numbers, and the numbers simply would not be tidied away so easily. Around 60% of first class survived that night, around 40% of second class, and only about a quarter of third class, with most of its children and more than half of its women, lost. You do not need a locked gate or a wicked order whispered in the dark to explain a pattern like that. You do not need a conspiracy at all. An arrangement that places the poor deepest, warns them last, and leaves them furthest from too few boats will produce exactly those figures entirely on its own, quietly, without anyone ever having to decide out loud that the poor should die. The inquiry found no villain, because it was never really looking at the right thing. The unfairness here was not contained in a single cruel act committed by a single person. It was built into the design itself. How they were remembered. And that unfairness reached even into how these passengers were remembered afterward, or, more accurately, how easily they were allowed to be forgotten. Think about how differently the dead were recorded, depending entirely on which deck they had slept on. The wealthy who were lost became the subject of enormous public attention, their faces printed in newspapers around the world, their fortunes carefully tallied, their final hours described in loving, often heroic detail. Their names were known, spelled correctly, and repeated for years afterward. They died as individuals, each one a story the whole world felt it somehow knew personally. The third-class dead received almost none of this. For the most part, they appeared, if they appeared at all, as a simple column of names in a list, and often not even accurate ones at that. They were the anonymous many, the immigrants and the poor, remembered in bulk rather than one by one, their individual lives collapsing quietly into a single grim total that newspapers could print in a single sentence and move on. The world mourned the wealthy by name, and the steerage passengers by number. Even their names, when they were written down at all, were frequently wrong. Many were immigrants whose names had been recorded phonetically by clerks who didn't speak their languages, their real names bent and mangled into something an English-speaking hand could spell, so that they entered the historical record already distorted. To be misspelled on the passenger list and misspelled again on the list of the dead was to be slightly erased even in the very act of being remembered, one's own name no longer quite one's own. Whole families disappeared this way, leaving almost nothing behind. No photograph to show what they had actually looked like. No obituary to explain who they had been or what they had hoped for. No monument beyond a shared line in a ledger somewhere. A father, a mother and their children, reduced permanently to a bracket in a list. They had crossed an entire ocean to begin a new life, and instead, they simply ended. And the record of that ending was so thin that it was almost as if they had barely existed at all. For a very long time, this was simply how the story got told, from the top deck down. The grand staircase, the millionaires, the noble sacrifices of the famous, with steerage appearing only ever as a statistic, a sad number tucked into the margins of someone else's tragedy. The people who actually made up the majority of the dead were, for decades, the smallest part of the telling, present in the totals, but almost entirely absent from the actual story. It has taken more than 100 years to begin putting that right. Patient historians and determined descendants have gone back through the records, correcting the mangled names, tracking down photographs, tracing scattered families, reclaiming these people one by one from the anonymity they were originally buried in. It's slow, careful, loving work. A name restored here, a story recovered there. And it is, even now, far from finished. But it matters, because it insists on the simple truth the original telling so casually ignored, that every single one of those numbers was a person, with a name that deserved to be spelled correctly, and a life that deserved to be remembered. What they were sailing toward. And so we come to the hardest part of this story to sit with, which is not really how these people died, but what they were dying toward. Every single person in those lower bunks was aimed at a future, not some vague, formless hope, but a specific one. A concrete plan for a concrete life, carried carefully across the ocean, folded up beside the good clothes and the photographs, waiting only to be unpacked on the other side. Think about how particular those futures actually were. A job already arranged, a place at a factory or on a farm secured months earlier by a letter from someone who had made the crossing before them. A brother or a cousin standing on a pier in New York at this very moment, scanning the crowd for a familiar face that would never come down the gangway. A patch of land out west, waiting to be worked. A small shop waiting to be opened. A marriage waiting to be begun. A family waiting to be raised somewhere that didn't know their old poverty, or their old names, or the old ceilings that had always been just a little too low. Each of these passengers was carrying a blueprint for who they were about to become. They had paid everything for it. That's the detail that should stay with you longest. 2 months of wages, sometimes more. The sale of nearly everything they owned. The severing of every tie to the only home they had ever known. All of it spent on a ticket to a life that was, by that final Sunday night, only 4 nights away. They had already done the hardest part. They had left. They had crossed almost the entire width of an ocean. The new world was so close that the rumor of an early arrival had lifted an entire deck into genuine joy just hours earlier. And then it was taken from them, in the dark and the cold, a few days short of everything. So the children never grew up American. The jobs went unworked. The shops were never opened. The land was never claimed. The marriages were never begun. The letters that should have gone home, the ones that would have simply said, "We arrived, we are safe, it is everything we hoped it would be," were never written. And the families waiting for them received instead only silence or a name on a list. An entire generation of futures simply stopped, all at once, within sight of the boat lights, and the world, for the most part, scarcely paused to notice which futures they had actually been. And here, perhaps, is the deepest irony buried in this whole story. The people lost in the bottom of that ship were the exact kind of people who went on to build the country they had been sailing toward. Hopeful, hard-working, ordinary immigrants, the very stock that raised the cities and worked the land and shaped the new world into what it eventually became. The ones who died in steerage that night were not lesser passengers on a great ship. They were the future of a nation, cut short. And the nation they were meant to help build mostly kept its eyes fixed on the famous few, whose coffins sat out on deck. For 100 years and more the story was told that way, from the top down, the millionaires. The grand staircase, the gallant goodbyes exchanged in evening wear. Steerage appearing only as a statistic, a sad number tucked into the margins of someone else's tragedy. But the true weight of that night was always down below, in the bunks near the engines, among the people who had bet absolutely everything they had on a better life, and lost it 4 nights from shore. The world mostly looked at the millionaires. Tonight we looked at them instead. So there it is, a crossing that began with a dream folded carefully into a single suitcase and ended in cold water 4 nights from shore. You spent 2 months of hard-earned wages on a ticket. You passed the inspection at the dock, found your narrow bunk beside the humming engines, shared your 2 bathtubs with 700 strangers, and sang homesick songs in a dozen languages, in a warm little room at the very bottom of the grandest ship the world had ever built. You were so close you could taste the new world waiting on the other side. And then the ship you had been promised was unsinkable, met the one thing it could not survive. And the people placed deepest inside it were the ones the sea reached first. Tonight, we didn't tell this story from the grand staircase looking down. We told it from the bunks near the engines, looking up, because that is where most of the lost truly lived. The immigrants and the hopeful poor. The mothers who would not leave without their children. The families the ship scattered by design, and the ocean never gave the chance to reunite. For 100 years, the world mostly remembered the millionaires. Tonight, quietly, we remembered everyone else. So as you lie there now, warm and safe beneath a roof that isn't sinking, perhaps spare a soft thought for them. For the ordinary, stubborn, hopeful people who bet everything they had on a better life, and were lost within sight of the lights they had crossed an entire ocean to reach. They never made it to their shore, but they were real, and they mattered, and their names are slowly, patiently, being written back into the story where they always belonged. Because history isn't only about the famous few whose coffins were laid out on the open deck. It is, just as much, about the many who went quietly into the dark that night, still dreaming, right up until the very end of tomorrow. Rest easy. You made it home,